Thank you for watching The Thought Criminals, which is taken from George Orwell's 1984. That describes me and my co-host, Ralph Benko. He is a regular contributor to Newsmax and a weekly columnist there, and he's also co-author of the Capitalist Manifesto and co-founder and chair of the 180,000 member Facebook group. And you know me, I am a regular contributor to Townhall and the editor of Intellectual Conservative. So this week, we are going to discuss an article I wrote that was prompted by something Ralph talks about all the time.
He's still my heart, Senator Sinema, future president of the United States of America.
And then we will move on to an article that Ralph wrote about Bretton Woods and some advice he has for Biden. So to begin with, Ralph is constantly praising Kyrsten Sinema, our senator from Arizona, and talking about how wonderful she is because of a few things she has done in Congress to thwart the Democrats' agenda. And he even
says the progressive agenda, which is not identical with the Democrats' agenda. Play fair.
Okay, because pretty much everything else, she's standard Democrat. Right. She just goes along with the party. Right. So I have a problem with this because I feel like she's getting way more kudos than she deserves. And I hear people like Ralph saying Kyrsten Sinema for president 2024. And no, I think this is
actually, to be fair, it's Manchin Sinema in 2024, Sinema 2032. Okay, she's young. She's got a long runway ahead of her. So let her serve 8 years as a vice president to kind of get her, to kind of mature and get her executive chops up, and then she can serve as president after 8 years in the Naval Observatory, observing her naval.
Okay, well, since you describe yourself as the second most conservative in the world, and you put that in your column that we're going to discuss today. You reminded people.
Yeah, the Washington Post called me the second most conservative man in the world. I take that as a badge of honor, and we can if there's enough time, I can reveal who the most conservative man in the world is. It's not who you think, but I'll settle for number 2. That's not a bad accolade, particularly coming from the enemy, the Washington Post. So yes, I am proud of my paleoconservatism. I drag my knuckles through the sand with pride.
So if that is how you describe yourself, you cannot be calling for somebody like Kyrsten Sinema to run for president, considering her record is just about as bad as most of the other Democrats in the Senate. She has a lifetime rating from the American Conservative Union of 14. She has a lifetime rating from the Heritage Foundation of 9. And if you look at her record beginning when she first entered Congress several years ago compared to today, she is actually gone down. She hasn't moved to the right. There is this misperception out there of her as being more moderate than she really is, because the handful of bills that she has stuck her neck out on, disagreeing with the progressives, is a couple of high profile bills like Build Back Better, election integrity. I mean, a couple of high profile bills. That's it. This woman is still a train wreck. Us conservatives don't want her anywhere in leadership. Yes, it's wonderful that she stuck her neck out on a couple of bills, but I believe she's only doing that because she's from Arizona. We're still a red state. We're not trending to the left. And I will give her this, she's very intelligent. And so she knows if she does not create the perception out there that she is more on the right, she's not going to win re-election.
Okay, well, first of all, let's talk about the senator from Arizona for a moment, okay? Arizona has a distinguished record of sending mavericks to the US Senate, just one at a time. Your Mr. Kelly there is a sort of garden variety cookie cutter progressive, so he does not rise to the dignity of an Arizona state senator. But you had Barry Goldwater, who was a maverick, You had John McCain, who was a maverick. I was not a big McCain fan, but give him credit where due. And now you have Kyrsten Sinema, who is following in the tradition of maverick. I did not call her a conservative, but I give her credit for standing up for the most important conservative issues where she has influence. And I take exception with the ACU, take exception with the Heritage Foundation, both of whom, by the way, are far to my left, far to my left. And what they have is they have a report card that is not weighted by the political intensity and the importance of the issues. It's just kind of check the box. Where are you on this? 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 So your column, Rachel, was brilliant. Yes, her voting record with Biden has been lockstep, except where it really mattered the most, which is on the quote, Build Back Better, pink pork, $3.5 trillion, let's make America socialist again bill, which was absolutely catastrophic. And she, along with Joe Manchin, cut it at least in half and probably much more. It hasn't gone through yet. And I love the fact that she took a strong stand, stronger than some Republicans, actually, some rhinos, in fighting tax rate increases, which is just good old pure supply side. Now, admittedly, she disappointed me when she came out in favor of a surtax on the super rich. And so that kind of tarnished my untarnished admiration for her a little bit. But to me, fighting Build Back Better and fighting the pay-fors, the tax increases on Build Back Better, and fighting the borrowing for Build Back Better was outweighed all of those stupid little party line votes that she made, because you kind of got to stay with your tribe for the most part. If you're going to be a Democrat, you really have to follow the lead of your president if he's a Democrat for the most part. But where it really counts, where the rubber hits the road, she presented herself as a true maverick and a true profile in courage. And plus, she's got a wonderful fashion sense. I love the way she dresses. She is a credit to, she has raised the tone. I mean, who was it? He was one of, that funny guy who now works for MSNBC or CNN or somebody like that. The short guy who used to work for Clinton. I think he was his
Dick
chief.
Morris.
No, not Dick Morris. No.
Robert Reich.
I'm sorry?
Robert Reich.
No. Oh God. Oh, creep me out. No. But look, it doesn't matter. He called Washington, quote, Hollywood for the ugly. Okay. And Kyrsten Sinema is single-handedly, defied that. Okay. She brings style. She not as much as my other heartthrob AOC, but she brings enormous style to the US Senate, the way AOC brings enormous style to the House of Representatives. And I give them both points for style.
Okay, but we're just talking pure politics. And I have to quibble with you. I would not ever call Barry Goldwater a maverick. I think there's a lot of people who would object to that. He was very, very conservative. And so.
Yeah. He was so conservative that made him a maverick. He was a tough.
No, a maverick is somebody who kind of goes back and forth and you can't really trust them and they have,
No. A maverick is someone who does not toe the party line. Barry Goldwater pushed the entire GOP to the right. Barry Goldwater was far more libertarian than the Republican Party of his day. And that made him a maverick that I really admire. So I'm not using maverick as a heretic like you are, or I'm not using maverick as a euphemism for somebody who betrays the party's principles. The word heresy actually comes from the Greek word heretos, which means to think for yourself. And rather than parodying it as someone who just runs against the mob for its own sake, the way sometimes I mean, look, I would consider Mitt Romney to be a heretic, not a maverick. He was the guy who invented Obamacare, for gosh sakes. And when he was governor of Massachusetts, I believe he was pro-choice. Okay, I've got no love for him. He crossed a lot of my red lines. Okay, Senator McCain never crossed a red line, but he made me nervous. But I like the fact that he was independent minded. And I like the fact that Kyrsten Sinema was willing to stand up against her party's leadership and against their lunatic fringe progressive base to draw a line in the sand against BBB. And that struck me as having real guts and real principles, and makes her very interesting and presidential, or at least vice presidential timber. There.
I also wanted to address you pointing out that John McCain is a maverick. Now, I'm someone who I moved to Arizona in 1996 because of politics. I left the Seattle area because it was too liberal for me. And so I have closely followed politics in Arizona since then. And my theory on John McCain and his popularity and getting reelected as a moderate is not because Arizona voters wanted a moderate in office. He became elected and stayed in office because it was a perfect storm of events. He was a war hero who had been tortured. He had a lot of money. He was good at fundraising. He was a relentless campaigner. He was very charismatic. He had the whole package. So that kind of a package is what got him into office and kept him into office. It wasn't because we were slowly turning purple. I mean, if you look at, the leadership of Arizona right now, we are still very much on the right, despite whatever the main.
I know. I'm an honorary Phoenician. I'm an honorary Arizonan. I do not believe that Arizona is turning purple. And by the way, you just have to pick your battles. I hated McCain-Feingold campaign finance reform. Okay, I believe that it isn't a problem that there's big money in politics. I think that there's a problem there isn't enough big money in politics. As much as I disagree with Charles Koch and the way he squanders $100 million a year of money that should be going to people like you and me on Americans for Prosperity, which is a black hole. Okay, I think that McCain-Feingold was a sin against the Constitution, and I think we spend more rolling out a new package of Tide laundry detergent than we do on a senatorial election. That's nuts. Okay, we're talking about a multi-trillion-dollar entity that I'd like to shrink down, small enough to drown in the bathtub, to quote our friend Grover Norquist. Not that we would drown it in the bathtub, that would get us in trouble with PETA, but we want to shrink the federal government down to a nice, friendly house cat size instead of a great big lion and tiger eat us alive size. I'm all for that. And one of the ways to do that is to allow all the money to flow into politics that wants to, although I'm afraid the left is now outspending us by leaps and bounds. And so I wish our oligarchs would come to Jesus and start pouring money into the Republican Party and the conservative movement. And I hope some of it sticks to you, Rachel, because
we know the tech billionaires are almost monolithically on the left. And even if they weren't, they would get shaken down by the left-wing activists threatening to call them racist and all their other usual tactics that they.
I refuse to continue to call you out on your jihad against the tech billionaires who are successful capitalists through and through. And I'm bored of arguing, of using up our show to argue the virtues of capitalism and its flower with
you
big.
You just don't want to get this video banned on YouTube again, admit it.
No, I do want to get it banned on YouTube. It brings us thousands of, every time we get banned, we end up getting many more viewers. And there's a backstory to that, by the way. Did you know, this is actually a true fact, that back in the days back in the early 1900s, the city fathers of Boston, particularly the League for Human Decency or some other very Catholic organization, used to ban books in Boston. And so there were lobbyists, the authors and the publishers would sneak in one line that they would know that would be a tripwire for the League for Civic Decency. It was either too sexy or too blasphemous or too vulgar. They would always put in like one sentence or one paragraph that they knew would be a trigger. And then they hired lobbyists to get their book banned in Boston based upon this line, because if they could put "banned in Boston" on the cover of it, it would turn into a bestseller all across the rest of the United States. So I'm not afraid of YouTube banning us. Bring it on, guys. It's very, very healthy for our ratings.
All right, that settles it. Our next show will be COVID and election integrity. You want to throw in a discussion of Q as well?
Right, yes, where we go one, we go all, so maybe that'll get us done.
I was joking, okay? I'm just sorry. But on that note,
yeah, me
let's
too.
Move on to your interesting
I'm not sure that Twitter's AI algorithms have a sense of humor, though. And now that Jack Dorsey, who's a fairly right-wing guy, has gone off to run Square and turn it into Block, and now it's in the hands of a new person who's just fired most of the senior executives. I'm worried that he's going to steer Twitter to the left, and we'll just have to see. I'm
already shadow banned on Twitter, so like, what else can they do to me?
Nothing.
Yeah. So okay. So let's move on to your interesting column on Bretton Woods, and you might as well explain to everybody.
Let's tell people what Bretton Woods is. Bretton Woods
exactly.
is a city in New Hampshire where there's this big hotel, the Hotel Washington, that after World War II, or as World War II was winding down, there was a huge monetary conference to figure out what we were going to do, because we went off the gold standard at the beginning of World War I. And then after World War I was over, there was a monetary conference in Genoa, Italy, called the Genoa Conference, that put together a funky parody of the gold standard called the gold exchange standard. That was the gold standard without the rules that made it work and made it help the world prosper through a golden age. And then after World War II, that fell apart. So they stuck the gold exchange standard back together. So we had the semblance of a gold standard, and we had really really very good economic growth, low inflation, high prosperity, and high fairness, high equity, where working people were getting better and better off in the post-World War prosperity boom, based upon this defective gold standard, but it was better than nothing. And then Richard Nixon, Lyndon Johnson shut down the London gold pool and de facto closed down the Bretton Woods gold standard, post-war gold standard. And then Richard Nixon, under the guidance of that evil Svengali John Connally, who was shot with Kennedy in Dallas, but who survived. He was the governor, and then he became Treasury Secretary. He was the one who said, you know, the dollar is our currency and your problem. He was incredibly arrogant. So Nixon didn't know anything about the economics. He just was he was just a tough politically shrewd son of a gun. And so he deferred to Connally, who essentially closed the gold window. They had planned to revalue the dollar from $35 an ounce to $43 an ounce or something like that, but they never got around to it. And so they took us off the remnants of the gold standard. Instead of mending it, they ended it. And then Nixon, in his notorious April 15th, 1971 speech announcing this, along with the other elements of the Nixon shock, wage price controls, horrible, straight out of the Communist Manifesto, a 10% tariff wall around the United States. I mean, it was hideous. He said, hey, let me lay to rest the bugaboo about devaluing the dollar. Your dollar will buy as much tomorrow as it does today. And that was literally true, Tricky Dick. On August 16th, it did buy as much as it did on August 15th, but very rapidly afterwards, the inflation genie, which the gold handcuffs had kept had kept in prison, flew out of the bottle, and within the next 10 years, the dollar lost 85% of its purchasing power. A 1981 dollar would only buy 15 cents as much as a 1971 dollar. And that was all Johnson and Nixon taking us off the gold standard. Then Reagan put Paul Volcker, actually Carter put Paul Volcker in, but Reagan told Paul Volcker that he would back him up to do what he had to do to emulate the gold standard and slay the inflation dragon. And he did it. It was brutal. He did it through recessions. He did it through 20% interest rates for mortgages. It was really brutal, but it worked. And it kept inflation quiet for 40 years. And then we had Clinton, who also had good monetary policy, originally under Alan Greenspan, until he lost his way. And Alan Greenspan, just 3 or 4 years ago, God bless him, admitted that he was very specifically emulating the gold standard and doing his monetary policy the way he was watching the price of gold and doing it what the gold standard would have done. And we had so much economic growth, 4% a year. It was fabulous under Reagan. And then we lost it under George H.W. Bush, who broke his read my lips, no new taxes pledge, throwing us into a recession. Clinton got in, and Clinton cut the capital gains tax rate, reformed welfare, and also had a really great monetary policy under Alan Greenspan, to the point where we were all getting very affluent, we working people, and it was so good that the federal government went into surplus instead of deficit for years. So, and by the way, Clinton, people don't remember this, but he was a tightwad. He did not let the federal government expenditures grow extravagantly in the way that Bush did, the way that Obama did, and the way that Trump did. So
Trump had COVID to deal with, so you got to give him a little bit of leeway there.
No, thank you. He cut taxes for the rich in ways that really stoked the deficit in shameful ways. And by the way, this was not like Reagan's tax cuts, which was across the board. It was for everybody. It wasn't just for the rich. Trump never saw a corporate or rich person's tax that he didn't want to cut, but he didn't cut my taxes.
Note for a future show. Let's debate Trump's tax cuts on a future show.
Okay, deal. Let's write columns about it. You can tell the world how great they were, and I can tell the world how it was just mercantilist oligarchy, sops to the rich, and then we can have a nice little argument about that. The point here is monetary policy is invisible. It's like the oxygen in the air, which is invisible, but it is crucial to have the right amount, not too much, not too little, just right, the Goldilocks amount of liquidity in the marketplace to make the economy hum along without inflation. And Jerome Powell has blown it. We are now getting the worst inflation in 30 years, and Biden just reappointed him. Now, after his reappointment, he's beginning to make noises about tapering his injection of liquidity into the marketplace. But frankly, I'm not sure I trust him. I would rather have an inflation hawk rather than an inflation dove there. And so bottom line is, the only way that we know from empirical evidence, from having done it, from having seen it done over and over again in history, to create wonderful prosperity-inducing economic growth, equitable prosperity, so that working class as well as the wealthy are prospering, and it's not just all going to the top 1% or the top 10%, like it's been doing since Nixon took us off the gold standard, except for Reagan and except for Clinton. Okay, the only way we know how to keep interest rates low, keep the economy humming at a 4 or even 5% annual real GDP rate of growth without triggering inflation is the gold standard, okay, which is heavily associated with Republicans. But as I write in my column, who was the guy who initiated great deregulation? It was Jimmy Carter. He deregulated the railroads, he deregulated trucking, and most important of all, he deregulated beer under the under the pre-Carter era, there were 3 beer companies, the big majors, Anheuser-Busch, Coors, and one other. He was the one who repealed the law, signed the law repealing the law against home brewers. So the craft beer renaissance that we have now is all thanks to that teetotaling Southern Baptist President Jimmy Carter.
Okay, well, Ralph, I want you to tell our millions of viewers what percentage chance there is that Biden is going to reinstitute the gold standard.
0. There is a 0%. I told him this is what he should do in a Nixon to China kind of move, because if somebody from the left, center left, a Joe Biden, actually introduces the gold standard, there will be no resistance from the right. He'll be able to get it through. And just the way Richard Nixon was deemed a staunch anti-communist for his work in the US House, persecuting Alger Hiss, the gentleman commie spy, that it created a reputation for him as a staunch anti-communist. He could go and kiss Chairman Mao's ring without being called soft on communism. That's Nixon to China. Biden to gold, same thing. Biden could afford to do this, and it would make him it would allow him to preside over vibrant economic growth. It would immediately within 18 months and before the 2024 election, end inflation, bring it down below the 2% that we've been having under the former thing. And it would create an uprising of great jobs. And he could go down in history as an even greater president than Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which is what he aspires to. So I gave him this great advice. Do you think he called me up and said, Ralph, can you come over to the West Wing and walk us through this? Do you think he had Janet Yellen invite me over for tea, or the head of his economic council, whose name I can never remember, to basically say, go over to what's the name of that grill right across from the Treasury, the Old Ebbitt's Grill, and pick Benko's brain, figure out how we do this, because there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. Do you think he would have thought he would have summoned me, at least through one of his minions, to say, Benko, this is brilliant, this is genius. I want to go down on history as a prosperity creating president. You have shown me the way. Crickets.
He's figured out you're the second most conservative man in the world. That's
well, since I put it right in my column, it's not exactly hard to figure out. But when you're right, you're right. So the good news here, and you'll see it in my next column next Monday, which is talking about, since Biden balked at bringing the gold standard forward and restoring it, and the golden age of equitable prosperity that comes with it, this opens the door for Ron DeSantis, Glenn Youngkin, and maybe even Chris Christie to grab this fumble, to recover this fumble, and to start riding and to start running for president on the gold standard. And I suppose, Kyrsten Sinema could as well, or Joe Manchin, but I don't think they're going to primary their own president. So this is a fumble that the Republicans can now recover, and the presidential aspirants in the Republican Party can grab the gold standard, which is not just great policy, it's great politics. And do you know, there was a poll done about 10 years ago about the gold standard. And do you know who the 3 most enthusiastic demographics for the gold standard are? Blacks, Hispanics, and union members, blue collar workers, which is the demographic that we need to tear away from the progressives who pretend to be fighting for their interests, but really aren't. We are fighting for their interests, and we're making big inroads among Blacks, among Hispanics, and among blue collar voters. And all we need to do is to get Glenn Youngkin to grab or Ron DeSantis to grab the gold standard and crusade on that as their signature economic policy, and they will glide through to a landslide victory in 2024 with a veto-proof majority in the Senate and a massive majority in the House. They will quickly enact the classical, go forward to the classical gold standard, and we will enter a golden age of peace and prosperity.
And what's the percentage chance that one of them will do that?
2%, 5%, 10%, I don't know. It's not a majority chance, but hey, it is infinitely more than the 0% chance that the Democrats will do it. So I'm going to be selling this like a carnival barker selling soft ice cream in on a 100-degree county fair day to the Republican aspirants, except Josh Hawley, who I just can't.
And not Chris Christie. He's a rhino. We don't want him in office.
You're right, and not Chris Christie. I was just throwing Chris Christie in there because, you know, he's I figured it might annoy Youngkin or DeSantis enough that they might take a harder look at it. By the way, Mitt Romney did. Mitt Romney's people flew me to Boston to debrief them on the gold standard back in 2012, which I had fully briefed out because they were worried that, you know, that Ron Paul was picking up a significant chunk of support, and he was, even though he wasn't actually for the gold standard, he was associated with the gold standard in the public mind. And so they wanted to find out if they could appropriate it in a way if it looked like Ron Paul was eating into their electoral, into their nomination margin. So politics is quirky. And by the way, I've never told anybody that publicly before, not because I was ashamed of it, it's just because it never came up. So, you know, I'm going to be making a lot of chatter about why the gold standard is great politics as well as great policy. And you know, word gets around, and who knows, they might be curious enough to say, hey, you know, let me take a look at that. I might be able to pocket the 10% Ron Paul vote if I were just willing to, you know, Newt Gingrich called for, I met with Newt back in 2016 when he was running before he got torpedoed by his ex-wife, who told some very embarrassing stories about him. And I went up to him at one of these political events. I said, Mr. Speaker, you were in favor of that you signed on to the Jack Kemp, you were a co-sponsor of Jack Kemp's Gold Standard Act of 1984. Would you be willing to support a gold commission like Reagan? And he said yes, and he started campaigning on it. And as soon as he started campaigning on it, his numbers started going up. And then he got torpedoed by his ex-wife, who happened to mention on 60 Minutes that he asked her for an open marriage, which turned out to be not such a shrewd political move. And he immediately, you know, tanked after that. But it's not out of the question that some of the top tier aspirants, Ben Carson made favorable comments about the gold standard until he tanked himself. And the other African American, the one who wrote An Army of Davids, who passed on from COVID about a year. Herman Cain was affirmatively for the gold standard. So just, you know, I'm now going to say that it's a 20% chance that one of the top tier candidates, Republican candidates, is going to pick it up. And once one does, don't be surprised if it catches on the way, you know, tax rate cutting caught on under Reagan. So there.
I'm in your court. I support it like you do, and I say keep up the pressure, Ralph. And on that, I think we will end our show for this week.
Okay, but I want a commitment from you, Rachel. You don't have to give it, but I have to ask for it. Is I want you to sell the gold standard to Attorney General Brnovich, who's running for Senate, and it would be an interesting plank for his platform to experiment with and see whether it brings a vibrant response. So would you kind of run it by him?
I will let you know what he says.
Thank you, Rachel.
Goodbye, everyone.
Live long and prosper.